Hi, I'm Jennifer Simpson, and welcome to another episode of Here's the Deal. Today, we're going to be talking about a difficult topic, but one that I think is on the minds of some folks in the HD community, and that is suicide. We are joined today by the wonderful Dr. Arik Johnson. Some of you might know Arik from his work on the board of directors for HDSA. He is the former chairman of the board. You might also recognize him from convention, where he has very generously auctioned himself off many years in a row for the NYA. You might also know him from his work with the HDSA Center of Excellence at UCLA. Welcome, Arik.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sitting down and talking about a topic that I think is on the minds of a lot of people in the HD community, but it can be a little bit difficult to talk about, and that is suicide. So something that I want to start off with is people have some ideas about how prevalent suicide is within the HD community. How prevalent is suicide really for folks who are impacted by HD?
You know, we know this from some of the studies that have been done over the last several years, that the suicide rate and the number of people who actually think about suicide is higher in HD than it is in the quote-unquote normal population. Mm-hmm. The term suicidal ideation is something that you'll hear us mention, and that's when people are thinking about suicide. There's both passive and active ideation. Passive is when someone might say, you know what, I kind of wish I could just go to sleep and not wake up. Whereas active ideation is someone saying, I'm thinking about doing something to kill myself. Mm. Passive ideation, we think, is in about 20% of the population. So while it's a big number, it's probably not as big as some people think, but we do want to recognize that it is there. And about 1 out of 5 folks, the active suicidal ideation is less, but it is about 5 times higher than the normal population. So we do definitely know that people who are living in the HD community think about suicide more.
Mm. So if someone is having that passive suicidal ideation, does that mean that they will necessarily move into active suicidal ideation?
That's a great question, but the answer is no. Okay. Passive suicidal ideation is actually quite common in general. People think about it more than I think we understand, and it's just because people don't talk about it that we're not aware of it. This information that we have came up through studies, and so these are people who were being asked specifically about it, but more often than not, people won't tell other folks if they're thinking about it, even if it is that passive ideation.
What do you think keeps people from having those conversations? Say, if I were to be in a place in my life where I was thinking about sort of having those thoughts, intrusive thoughts about not wanting to wake up, about not wanting to be around anymore, not necessarily having a plan yet, but those intrusive thoughts were like, oh, I wish it would be easier if I weren't here. It would be easier if I didn't exist anymore. What do you think keeps people from from opening up about those thoughts?
I think people are concerned about scaring other people. Mm. I think people might feel ashamed that they've had those kinds of thoughts. And a lot of times, and this is probably something you hear a lot too, people are, I don't want to burden anyone else with my troubles, right? I don't want to put my problems on somebody else. I should be able to deal with it myself. So for a number of different reasons, people do not talk about it. And the thought that's going through my head is, of course, I encourage everyone to do so. Yeah. And to everyone out there, I would encourage you to talk about it if you're thinking about it, but we understand why people might not.
Yeah, and it's interesting. There's something I sort of constantly am talking to people about is the importance of either having a therapist, having a counselor, having someone who you feel is a safe space to talk about problems or issues or thoughts that you might be worried about burdening someone else with. And I know a lot of times in the community, there's this feeling of like, well, other people have it worse than me. I can just handle this on my own. I don't need to reach out for help. It's not that bad, without realizing that maybe it actually has gotten to a point where it's beyond their ability to handle. Who would be if you were in that space where you were having those sort of passive thoughts, do you have to wait until you become more actively suicidal to reach out for help, or can you reach out before you get to that crisis point?
I would hope that a person would reach out well before they get to a crisis point. To your point, I think it would be great if everyone had that counselor or a psychologist or a doctor that they could talk to, but sometimes it's just being able to reach out to a friend or a family member and say, hey, I've been thinking about this. And sometimes just starting that conversation allows a person to feel a little bit better about it, because now I'm not just dealing with it by myself, like you were saying, but to say, there's someone who cares about me who says, ideally they're going to say, let's talk about this and see where we can go with this and look for different resources. But sometimes it's just taking that first step, whether it is with a professional or whether it is with someone that you know and love, that you can at least start the process of getting connected to some level of resource.
Right, so like being able to recognize who is this safe person in my life.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and then potentially also having that safe person say, I actually know what you're talking about. I know what you're going through. I've been through it myself.
Right.
If you are at that crisis point where you have thought of a plan, where you've figured out how you would want to do it, are there crisis teams that people can reach out to in their cities? I've heard of sort of crisis response teams within law enforcement communities, within sort of first responders. How would those kinds of people help you if you were feeling actively suicidal?
If someone is feeling like, I want to do something to take my life and I've thought about it and this is how I'm going to do it, one of the easiest things you can do is call 911 and actually say, I am feeling suicidal. They would more likely than not assign you to what we call a psychiatric emergency response team. So these are these are law enforcement professionals, they're EMTs, they're sheriff's offices who have been trained to work with people who are suicidal. So they've got some additional level of training. There are also national hotlines, national suicide hotlines. There are crisis numbers in different community programs. There are resources out there. The simplest is probably 911 because that's across the country. But I'm hoping we can also just provide some information like the National Suicide Hotline number so people can have that. But just to know that reaching out like that is a good start, or talking to that trusted person. They might be able to say, you know what, let me go make a call and let's see what we can do. Another option, if you're with someone, they can drive you to an emergency room.
Yeah. I'm wondering, so if someone gets to that point, I imagine something that might keep someone from calling for help is the fear of going into a mental hospital, right? A fearing of what that would look like. What actually happens if you are actively suicidal, you reach out for help, and you do end up going into inpatient care? What would that look like for a person?
If a person is going into an ER or meeting with professionals who are going to talk to them about their thoughts about suicide, they're going to assess how imminent a threat is this, how serious a threat is this. Based on their professional assessment, they'll make recommendations. In most places, they can be put on what we call a psychiatric hold, where someone is kept at the hospital for a certain amount of time for observation and intervention. But sometimes people will note that from the time that they made the call to the time that they've now seen the professionals, their desire to kill themselves has lessened, and they are not actively feeling suicidal. So sometimes it's even just taking the step of making the call that allows a person to start thinking about this and processing it a little bit more, to say, while I'm feeling really bad right now, maybe I don't actually want to die right now. Maybe I just needed to let someone know how bad I'm feeling. Or maybe I still do want to feel that way, but now I've connected with people who can give me the resources that I need to work on this and to hopefully feel better.
Yeah, so it's not, making the call doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be, as some people might think of it, like committed, right? I think that might be a fear that people might have to keep them from reaching out once they're at that active point.
Absolutely. It might sound funny to say, but you don't make the call and then someone shows up with a straitjacket. It does not work that way.
Yes.
There's a lot of conversation that has to happen. There's a lot of exploration and investigation that has to happen. And if an intervention is necessary, it's usually something that is done collaboratively. We talked about what our concerns were for your safety and well-being, and we said these were the things that we're going to do. Now we're going to do this. Yeah. So it usually is something that the professionals will try to do with the person who's feeling that way, rather than doing it to them.
So I'm also thinking about how, especially in HD, how like impulsivity can play into suicidal ideation or active suicidal ideation. Either for someone who is HD positive and symptomatic, or even if you are young and at risk, and you are at a point in your teenage years, when your brain development, when you are just more likely to be impulsive than if you were a little bit older. What would be some sort of ways that a person who might be in that space can help work themselves through one of those impulsive moments where they might be thinking, okay, I'm just going to do it now. I'm done. What are some things that a person could try and do in that moment to give themselves a little space to reflect and to really calm down and think about what they want?
I'm glad you bring up the concept of impulsivity, because it is different in the person who is at risk versus the person who is known to carry the HD gene and who is beginning to become symptomatic.
Right.
Adolescent, teenage, early 20s impulsivity is there just because of the way we are developmentally at that point. We tend to think of ourselves as being a little bit invulnerable, right? Things aren't as permanent. And so the idea might not carry the same weight of consequence as we would later on in our development. So someone who is in their teens, someone who's in their early 20s might not entirely grasp the finality of a suicidal gesture or trying to take their own life.
Yeah.
For people who are living with HD and who know they have the gene and who are maybe starting to experience symptoms, including impulsivity, this is a little bit harder because it's part of the changes in the brain. That said, I would probably make the same recommendations to both, which is if you are feeling that way, if you are thinking that way, to stop yourself if you can, right? This is a self-moderation exercise. I'm thinking these things, I'm going to stop, I'm not going to do anything for a minute. To set a little bit of agreement with yourself. If you know that you are feeling suicidal, sometimes this is a therapy technique. We might say, if you're feeling suicidal, before you do anything, call my voicemail, tell me what's going on, or page me if it's an emergency, or we'll give those instructions. What you're doing is you're putting some time in between the initial thought and a possible action.
Yeah.
For people that don't necessarily have the immediacy of a therapist, we might say, if you have the thought, stop, go find that safe person, whether it's a friend or family member, and let them know. And sometimes it's just going from the thought of action to doing something else that allows a person to continue processing rather than making an attempt.
Yeah.
Right? It sounds really easy to say, but someone who is suicidal might not in that moment be able to do so. So it's why we talk about it. It's why we talk about it now.
Yeah.
It's why we say, think about these things now, talk to your team and your therapist and your family and your friends now, so that you're actually kind of practicing this thing should you ever actually feel that way.
Yeah. Yeah, and also have those moments of being able to recognize when those thoughts are becoming more and more intrusive.
Right.
Now, something I also want to talk about that I think sometimes people put hand in hand is the idea is self-harm and suicidality. So if someone is self-harming, does that mean that they are also suicidal?
The short answer is no.
Okay.
Self-harm is something that we will see people do if they're having a hard time managing their emotions or experiencing things. There's often an element of control in self-harm. Self-harm is a very clinical term. We often talk about people who are cutting or engaging in behaviors that are really just to hurt themselves.
Right.
And people will do so for any number of different reasons, but control is often one of the underlying themes. People who engage in those behaviors are not immediately a suicide concern. People who are suicidal have greater levels of hopelessness or a belief that there is nothing out there for me, or it's a more kind of global thing. And the two things do differ. We are always, of course, going to look at someone who engages in those kinds of behaviors and ask and hopefully have a conversation about it. But it doesn't necessarily mean that that person will become suicidal. If I can add to that, we were talking before about this idea of passive ideation and active ideation. People who have passive ideation don't necessarily become actively suicidal. Mm-hmm. Someone who may think, I would just like to go to sleep and not wake up, isn't necessarily going to start saying, you know what, instead of that, I'm going to do something to kill myself. There's not always a direct correlation. If there's a presence of any sort of thoughts or any sort of that self-harming activity, we're going to want to talk about it and explore it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that someone's going to become actively suicidal.
Okay. So for example, if you were a parent or a friend of someone who you see is self-harming, it doesn't necessarily mean that they want to actively kill themselves, but it is still something to be having a conversation about. Right. You want to be able to go to that person and say, hey, I love you and I see that this is happening. You aren't doing this in a bubble, and it matters to me that you are hurting yourself. Right. Now, on the flip side of that, the other thing that I think a lot of people have to deal with is trying to handle or manage someone who is suicidal. So if you are the child of a person who has tried to kill themselves, or the sibling, the spouse, the caretaker, I think a lot of times those folks might feel like they are in control of whether a person becomes actively suicidal or whether a person tries to complete a suicide. How is that true? Can anybody sort of actively be in control of another person's actions or whether another person commits suicide?
Even as you were saying that, I was just trying to imagine what it would be like if a family member or a loved one came to me and said, Arik, I want to kill myself. And I can tell you, my first thought is, I have to make sure this doesn't happen. Mm. It is very normal for the person who's being approached by someone who is suicidal to think, now I have to take care of this. And it's my responsibility. And if they do kill themselves, it's all my fault. Like, those are very common thoughts that people will have. Mm. The reality is, I can't make anyone else do anything. Mm. I can offer as much support as possible. I can provide all of the resources. I can say, call this hotline, or I'm going to get you in to see the doctor right away. But it's not my power to make someone's thoughts change. I can't change the way that you're thinking. I can try to offer all the tools that I have that will hopefully allow you to think differently, but it's not something that the individual can control, which I'm saying this now hoping that it makes people feel better, but I can also understand how that might make people feel worse. Yeah. Wow, I can't actually make this better. Yeah. I think it's important to just be aware that you can't make someone else feel anything. You can't make someone specifically think something unless they want to. And then you're not even making them do it. You're just giving them direction and hopefully encouragement and support to do so. Right. I say all of this to try to take pressure off of the person who's being approached. Yeah. Yeah, sort of that recognition that we aren't omnipotent, we don't have that kind of power, even when we wish we did. Right. And sort of on that note, equally, if you know that someone in your family is struggling, if you know that either they've been passively or actively suicidal, talking to them about it isn't going to increase their likelihood of trying to complete Absolutely. The action. Yeah. I think it's a very common concern that I hear clinically and in conversations with people around the country is, I'm afraid to ask him or her about it because in doing so, it might make them think about it more. Mm. And the reality is that's not the case. It's not that I can't make someone more suicidal. Yeah. If someone is suicidal and they're sharing it, I think that's fantastic that they're able to talk about it. But by me asking someone, hey, how are you doing? Have you thought about, I know we talked about this before, but have you thought about killing yourself again since we had that last conversation? Mm-hmm. Me having that conversation with the person isn't necessarily going to say, oh, wow, I hadn't thought of that in a while. Yeah. But well, there's an idea. Yeah. So it's not going to increase the likelihood of that happening. It is, it's more a fear that person has, that I might trigger something. Yeah, so it's better to have the conversation than to sort of leave it and then have both people, either one person being actively suicidal and feeling alone, like they can't talk about it, and then someone else being deeply anxious and worrying that person is somehow going to commit suicide and that it will be their fault. If there's one takeaway from this entire conversation today that people get is please talk about it. I think it is important to have the conversation about it no matter what. And I want to encourage everyone to do it if they are feeling or thinking about this.
So if someone in your home is actively suicidal, a parent, a sibling, yourself, are there things that you can do that are sort of risk reduction at home? Like, for example, if your loved one is on, psychiatric medication, or if your family hunts and owns guns or knives, are there things that you can do in the home to try and help reduce risk?
Absolutely. And I was just thinking there's a number of ways to approach it. One of the first things is we've hopefully had a conversation about this so we know how the person has thought about it. If someone is thinking about suicide and they actually have a plan, I want to kill myself and I'm going to do it by taking all of my pills. Well, that gives me a clue of what I should be looking for at home. Well, you know what? How about we make an agreement that I'm going to manage your pills for you for a little while. I'll make sure that you've got them on a daily basis. If it's an emergency drug, I'll make sure that we've got it, just enough. You can absolutely make those plans. And we do encourage people clinically to do so. When we talk to people about their concerns about suicide, we will ask, are there guns in the house? If there are guns in the house, are they locked in the safe? Is the ammo somewhere else? Can someone else keep the key to the safe for a while? Can you take the gun out of the house for a while? Generally, if someone is talking to us about feeling suicidal, they would be more open to these kinds of changes. If someone says to me clinically, you know what, no, I'm not going to give up the key to the gun safe. This is going to take us in a different direction. But in those kinds of rare instances, we will act on it. Prior to that, I would just say for family members to know, if there are things that we're concerned about, we can minimize access to those things. We can put drugs in a little safe. We can get rid of firearms. We can take the knives and give them to the neighbor.
Right. So there, are some risk reduction things that you can do at home. If you are one of those sort of folks who's living in a household with someone who is suicidal, where can that person find support? What are the things that person can do to manage the effects of being around someone who is suicidal?
The recommendations I'm going to make are going to sound very similar to what we were saying before. If you can get into therapy, anyone who's ever seen me talk before, I will say, get a psychologist. We should all have one, or a counselor. It's not always possible, but try. See, that's a good place to go. Go to a support group. Since we are talking about people who are in the HD community, look for an HDSA support group. Talk to an HDSA social worker. Talk to your safe people. Right? We were talking about safe people for the person who's feeling suicidal. What about for the family member of a suicidal person? I hope they have safe people too that they can talk to. Being able to identify who their resources are is a key recommendation. Know who you've got. Know who's on your team and in your corner.
Yeah. And the other thing I think I want to touch upon as well is just quickly, whenever I think about therapy, I think sometimes you can think, oh, if I have a mental health issue or a mental illness, whether it's severe depression, anxiety, whether you're at a point of suicidality, sometimes there's this idea, well, it's a problem in my brain, I'll take medication, then I'll be better. Is that always, and in my mind, so the best, it's really a two-pronged approach, right? Medication can be an incredibly important part of a mental health regimen, but because it can manage and balance your brain chemistry. But at the same time, if you're also not addressing underlying issues that are enhancing feelings of depression, feelings of anxiety, then medication won't fix it. So that I also want to sort of check in with you as well. If someone is in a place where they can go to their, maybe they see a psychiatrist but don't see a therapist. Is there a recommendation like, find a safe person, find a counselor, someone you can talk to where it's not just, how's your medication doing? Do you feel okay? See you in 3 months.
My first response is, I'm so glad that person has a psychiatrist because they're at least doing that.
Yeah.
Right?
Fair
and
point.
So they've gotten in the door and they're addressing it to some level. I would always encourage the person to do what you're suggesting, which is to actively work on it, to have the conversation about it. Drugs can be very helpful in helping balance the neurochemistry. and help with the biological aspects of depression, anxiety, anger, irritability, or impulsivity, some of the things we see in HD.
Mm-hmm.
But once you work on balancing the brain itself, that's when you can start putting these active things into place. The active work of therapy, talking about what it is that triggers you. How do I respond to things? How might I change the way I respond to things?
Mm-hmm.
I think the therapy, the talk therapy, is a great tool. Clearly, because it's the work that we've
We
gone
like to
into.
do. Yeah.
But also because it really does allow a person to put some active systems into place.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, taking a pill is an active thing that a person can do, but the pill isn't necessarily going to help someone when they're feeling really, really down, really hopeless, and thinking, you know what, this time I'm just not going to be able to get over it.
Mm-hmm.
The work that they've done in therapy is what's going to help when they say, oh, right, I'm going to take a break before I do anything.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to call my best friend, or I'm going to call my therapist.
Yeah.
And that is where that practice work, the active behavioral intervention, comes into play.
Yeah. One thing I also want to hit on is something that I've heard in the community, which is this idea that, you know, I'm at risk, I want to test, but I'm worried that going through the testing process and testing positive might make me more susceptible to suicidality. Is there any sort of truth or to sort of that idea that, oh, if people who test positive are more likely to be suicidal than people who are gene negative or test negative?
I think the simple answer is probably yes, but it's more complicated than that.
Sure.
Right? People who are at risk, who are thinking about what their future might hold, who have seen a loved one or cared for a parent or a family member who's been symptomatic with HD or maybe has died from the disease, in thinking about their at-risk status might also be thinking about their possible future, which could impact their thoughts about suicide. I'm saying at risk on purpose because that means we don't know if they're gene positive or gene negative. At this point, they're reacting to something that they're thinking about,
Mm-hmm.
and whatever their internal brain chemistry is also going to be a part of this. But it's not so much the idea of going in for gene testing that is going to push someone over into that space. What we do know, and again, this is based off of studies, is people tend to express more active suicidal ideation during the time where they're becoming more symptomatic to the point of disability, meaning not being able to work or not being able to drive. That is an area that we are very concerned about clinically, and we'll look at more closely if people have ever expressed suicidal ideation, because it's at that time that people tend to be more actively thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
So we hear people talk about it a lot around gene testing. Research would indicate, and experience would indicate, that it's more when people are experiencing increased symptoms that there's more active thoughts about it at that time.
Right, at the point of loss of independence.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Sure. And I think there's also an importance of recognizing that if someone tests gene negative, right, that brings its own whole sort of grouping of thoughts, feelings, and ideas that could also lead someone to feel suicidal. That gene negative status doesn't mean that they are free and clear and are going to be great for the rest of their lives. You know, there is risk in both areas, and it's important to pay attention to your own mental health regardless of where you are on that spectrum.
Absolutely. I'm going to tell you right now, I think you should at some point do a conversation about gene negative testing, because
Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right. There's a whole other area of emotional response and impact that needs to be talked about.
Yeah. Oh, survivor's guilt is so incredibly real. And it's something that, you know, you're completely right. And thoughts for the future is something that people don't talk about as much because they think, well, I'm negative. Where do I even belong in this community anymore? Do I even deserve help anymore?
Right.
I'm free and clear. And if I feel bad about it, that somehow is my own weakness or my own issue to deal with. It's not, you know, I'm not deserving of help.
Right.
There are so many people who have it worse than me.
Right.
I have to sort of take this on myself. Are there any sort of other, you know, I'm thinking about what we've touched on today. In terms of suicide, the other thing to think about if someone is feeling suicidal is, and I think I've heard you talk about this before, but the idea of legacy, right? Once a suicide is completed, there isn't any control over your legacy, right? How you're thought of, how your family, how you are remembered. Is that also a conversation to have or to be with someone who might be suicidal is, once this process is complete, if you are active, and you take an action, that's it. You don't have control of how you might be remembered or how your family might find you, the impact that might have on them. How do you sort of discuss legacy with a person?
I think legacy is another topic that I might say, not even just related to suicide, but to the fact that we're all going to die at some point in time, and what do we leave behind for our family, our friends, etc. And legacy related to suicide, I think your point is completely accurate. I might be suicidal. I might be wanting to do this because of how I'm feeling, and I don't have any thought or awareness to how it might impact others. There's other times where people have this kind of false belief that if I do this, it's going to make it better for others. So I'm projecting something onto other people that even if they were to argue it with me, I'm not going to believe, because no, I know it's going to be so much easier for you if I'm not here. It is a conversation I think is important to have with people who have expressed feeling suicidal, just what might the possible impacts be. It can sometimes be a complicated conversation to negotiate because, again, someone might say, I don't care, or I think I'm doing something good, or we have to be able to approach and address each individual's response uniquely. But I think it is an important thing to think about. If you are feeling suicidal, I know you might not be thinking about it now, but what might it be like if you are gone? For those around you? What might you miss? What are the things that you think you will never, what are the things that you'll never have a chance to see again, right? And it's an interesting conversation to have with folks, because a lot of times they're like, oh God, I never thought of it that way.
Yeah. And I think those conversations also differ depending on where you might be within the course of the disease. But they're important conversations to have nonetheless, either with the facilitation of your therapist, with your other family members, to just have that discussion of, if you are feeling this way, if you are actively suicidal, how might it impact other people?
Right. Although I will add that can sometimes people feel guilty about that.
Yeah.
And doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk about it, but we should also be aware that is sometimes the way that people respond. And if we ask them that and they say, yeah, I am, we can normalize that and say, it's understandable. Other people feel that way too, but let's explore some other possibilities, because that's absolutely one way of feeling, but there might be some other things too.
Yeah. Well, Arik, I wanted to thank you so much for having this conversation with me, for shining some light on a topic that I think a lot of people have been in the dark about, or feel like they have to keep in the dark. And hopefully this is sort of the beginning of a much larger conversation within this community about suicide, both active suicidal ideation, passive suicidal ideation, and then if you're around someone who is suicidal, how to help yourself. So yeah, thank you so much.
Oh no, thank you for having me and for letting me have this conversation with you about it, for everyone else who's out there to just know, if you are thinking about it, please talk to someone about it, because there are things that you can do for it, about it, and with it. And none of that can happen unless you don't say something first.
Yeah.
None of it can happen unless you say something first.
Yeah, right. You have to be that brave person to let that out first, right?
Yeah.
Because as we've learned many, many, many times, no one can read your mind.
Right.
As much as we all wish we could.
Right.
Right. So yeah, thank you so much. And that's the deal with suicide.